Welcome to this AgileSHIFT presentation. My name's Cameron Stewart, and I'm going to show you AgileSHIFT and the concept of the delta in AgileSHIFT. I'm a consultant and I spend my time helping organizations to understand the challenges they face in the contexts that they work in and to overcome those to survive and thrive in this changing environment. I'm going to show you the AgileSHIFT delta and why it's so necessary for organizations to both understand and control it. But I'm going to begin with a bit of a warning. The delta is really important for organizations, especially those that are working in a disrupted context. If you get this delta stuff wrong, you leave the door open for challengers and innovators and disruptors, and they're going to eat your lunch. So, let's begin by defining the objective. We need to understand what Agile actually means. And it's important to note that although the roots of Agile are back in Scrum and even before that in the 1980s, 1990s, even back to the 1970s, that today Agile has a different meaning. It's not just about process and framework. In fact, if we look at the word Agile with a lowercase a, we see that we could define it as the ability of an entity to continually, efficiently and responsibly serve the constantly changing needs of individuals, organizations and society. So yes, those ways of working that we have used for the past 10, 15, 20 years and more in software development are useful. We can learn from them. But we shouldn't restrict ourselves to thinking that Agile is simply for software development or for tech environments. In fact, all environments, as we will see, should benefit from considering many different ways of working, even using these in parallel. But why is it important for organizations to be agile? Why is this definition of Agile important? Well, if entities can't get to grips with serving their users and the organizations and society, then there's going to be a gap between what is needed or wanted and the satisfaction of that need or want. And this gap could manifest in several ways. Here are 6 as an example. Cost, time, quality, benefit, risk, and scope. In each of these areas, each of these relationships, a gap could open up. A cost gap is one where perhaps the cost of supply is too great for the cost, for the price to be right for the user. A gap in risk might be one where the organization doesn't want to take a risk on a new product, but the market needs it to. But hang on, isn't this just basic economics? This should be obvious to us all. This is how organizations have run for the past 100, 200, 1,000 or more years. Satisfy the needs or wants of the user and the customer, and you should be in good shape. But actually today there's a different challenge. And that's the one of tech involvement in day-to-day life and in work life. It means that people's understanding of what's possible is changing faster than ever before. They're more savvy, if you like, about the products that could be or that should be supplied. And on top of this, the ability of organizations to fulfill those demands is getting better as the involvement of tech improves or increases. So actually, if we were to chart that, we would see that a user wants and needs changing over time. We can see that each time period there's an increased want or need on the last time period. And this curve is only getting steeper and steeper and steeper. And of course, here the problem is that if we respond in a linear way to this exponential growth curve of wants and needs, the gap between supply and demand will open and open and open. So the gap grows. The gap between what users want or need and the satisfaction that's offered by entities is constantly growing. And the pace of growth of that gap is constantly increasing. This is a dangerous spot for an organization to find itself in. As the gap between demand and supply grows, disruptors see a growing opportunity. You see, that gap is an unfulfilled need, and that's what the disruptor is constantly looking for. Making an impact on a growing gap is cheaper per impact unit. If I want to make a 30% shift in that gap, it gets proportionally cheaper as the gap grows to do so. The gap becomes more difficult to narrow. The further an organisation lags behind what's wanted or needed, the bigger the distance to catch up. And large and legacy entities might find that the gap becomes so big, the challenge becomes so great, the best option that they have is to exit that market or that environment. In the worst case, this might mean that the organisation simply ceases to trade. So we can identify the challenge fairly simply. Why don't we just deal with it? Well, large and established entities aren't there by mistake. They've often got a long history of successful performance, successful delivery to those user wants and needs. Way back when, these organisations took a risk at a beginning or a formative stage. Perhaps they opened a third and fourth outlet when it would have been prudent to stick with two. Perhaps they bought a load of stock when maybe they should have only bought a small proportion and discovered whether they could sell that. But once they'd achieved a critical level of success, they then battened down the hatches. They then decided to reduce the risk of what they were doing. They built processes to protect them from the risk of buying the wrong thing or making the wrong thing or having the wrong partnership with another organisation. They told their people to be risk averse. When decisions needed to be made, they said slow down, put in more layers. This protects us from doing the wrong thing. Often the owner-manager who started the organisation could take a unilateral risk, but now decisions must be multilateral. And then they decide that they need to achieve an economy of scale in supply. So they reduce the number of products they offer and ask the customers to fit into a category. And eventually they asked regulatory bodies to regulate their industries. Yes, to prevent problematic participants in the market, but with the side effect of increasing the barrier to entry to new entrants. And of course, as this situation escalates, it becomes more and more difficult to find a new supplier or to switch supplier. Each supplier in a market develops a kind of a mini niche to serve a group of customers that will find it difficult to depart. And of course, we have to recognise the impact of luck on the success of large organisations as well. Often a lucky break occurs, and we can't do quite so much about that. But looking at these facts about large entities, we should recognise that now others will take startup risk the same as the large organisation did back when it started out. But today they'll be able to take those risks at a lower cost. The cost of having a go has dropped. There's no longer the need to invest in large-scale tech hardware. We can rent it. There's no longer the need to have premises. People are used to working from home and working flexibly. And services can be offered on a monthly software as a service basis, rather than having to invest large amounts of money in business systems. The concept of failing fast, of the lean startup, is very well known and very well used today. That is, start, have a go. If it doesn't work, stop, do something else. This increases the likelihood of a disruptor to try to impact on a market. And those who start up will take risks, but they use ways of working that allow early identification of failure threat. They might use agile ways of working, the capital A, the uppercase A ways of working. They might have a lower cost to find the threat that's going to impact them. A lower cost then of dealing with that threat because the overall exposure is so low. And they understand better the link between threats and opportunities. Today, an entrepreneur, a disruptor, is likely to view a setback as a positive. They'll learn and they'll move forward more quickly than ever before. It's becoming a culture in entrepreneurship and disruption. And they'll exploit opportunities more aggressively than incumbents even can due to their anti-risk processes. As far as satisfying the customer goes, well, remember those large entities found success because they achieved economies of scale by categorizing the customer. Well, in a way that hasn't changed, but in a way it has. The large organization will build a partly homogeneous product. They'll build a product that has a single core. But they'll build a product with a single core that can serve each individual, so the individual believes that what they're receiving is a bespoke service. Think about Netflix, for instance. Netflix has a lot of content. It's got a single core, but it serves each user as if they're an individual. They can therefore achieve the economy of scale and supply because there are no more categories. As far as individuals see, there are no more categories. As far as the organization is concerned, everything is one big category that's capable of serving individuals on an individual basis. And individuals, organizations, and society see that there are options, and they pressure regulators to permit new and to encourage new entrants into market. And we can see this in the banking sector, where new entrants are better enabled than ever before to compete with large existing organizations. And finally, it's important to note that we are in a situation where individuals feel less closely aligned to a brand, and they're actually more focused on the satisfaction they receive from the product that they buy. Brand is important, but today that history and reputation is less important for the brand than its current ability to serve its users and customers. Gone are the days when an organization could rely on its brand to sell a product that didn't meet a need. The brand has to be strong, and the product or service has to be strong as well. So we're seeing a shift between the balance between brand and performance, and actually the consumers today rely more on reviews by their peers and perhaps by influencers more than they rely on the name of the brand. The threat to established entities with growing gaps is greater than ever and grows faster each day, because if they rely on their brand, well, and not on the product, they're again in a tight spot. And just for the avoidance of doubt, don't forget the importance of luck, even for the startup. Getting the right contract, getting the right review from the right influencer is so important for those brands. So what we've just looked at is the current competitive situation And it's that situation that AgileSHIFT is targeted at. It's developed to help organizations that face those threats to survive and thrive in that environment. So now we're going to move on and take a look at the delta. Now, we talked a little bit in the last 10 minutes about the gap. Those of you who are accountants or mathematicians or compile KPI reports regularly, you'll recognize the word delta as meaning difference or gap. So, the gap that we've described is the symptom of the organization's difficulty. The cause of the gap is the delta. That's the difference between the current state and what great looks like regardless of constraints. When an organization is looking for gaps, is looking for deltas, it should be looking at its products, services, the technology it uses, the processes that are in place, the education it offers to its team, its partners, its supply chain, and to its users and customers. The tools and techniques it uses, the materials that are incorporated into products, the regulations and rules in the market and within the organization. In fact, everything that the organization is, and more, they should look beyond their own organization into their partner chains. Everywhere that the deltas open, this gap between what's supplied and what the users want or need is opening. Now, the delta is not about value for money. The delta is the gap between, or is the difference between where we are today and what great looks like, what the very best it could be looks like, where we could imagine is possible without any constraint. Now, between these 2 points, there's actually an economically desirable state that satisfies the demand and supply. It narrows the gap to the point where the disruptor doesn't want to come into the market because there isn't enough economically achievable impact that's possible. This is the value for money zone for the delta. So now we've got a series of graphics which illustrate this. We'll start by describing the delta. The delta is where we are today for any process, any education, technology, tool, product, service. The difference between something that we do or that we have and what a great version of that looks like. So it might be that we supply products, we track the delivery of that product to our user with a 24-hour lag, and we say, well, what's the best track and trace lag that's available? Well, actually, if we look at a pizza company, they will give you, the user, an app that helps you to track your pizza almost live through the production and delivery process. That's what great looks like. Is that feasible for our organization? Is that possible? Well, not really. That would take far too much investment. So what great looks like is uneconomic. But is there an economic point between these two? And this is the point of narrowing the delta. In this diagram, we can see that the organization has moved. They've moved closer to what great looks like. Not all the way, but they've found an economically advantageous position. This is really important. Delta isn't about every part of the organization achieving the very best that it possibly could be in a very short period of time. It's about the organization moving in an economic way towards the best position it can. It's really simple. If we narrow the deltas, we narrow the threat. If we can narrow the deltas, we narrow the gap between the wants and the needs and the satisfaction of those wants and needs. This, it should be clear by now, is not a problem just for the delivery teams or the service teams. This is a whole entity problem. Every single individual in an organization, every process they use, every tool they use, every product or service they touch, must discover and work on moving that delta, reducing the delta, moving closer to what great looks like as quickly as it can in an economically possible way. It should also be clear that sheep-dipping teams in Scrum or Agile PM or Prince2 Agile or some Agile way of working isn't going to be enough. This is a transformational change, not a process or framework implementation. This is a shift to the culture and the behavior across the organization. This is actually why so-called agile transformations regularly fail to deliver the promised or expected value. And this is exactly why AGILESHIFT was created. This is why it exists. Let's now move on and look at the cost of narrowing the delta. Here's an example of a gap, of a delta. This might be a process, it might be a tool, it might be the education that we offer to an individual. We can see that the movement from where we are today to what great looks like has a cost. For this movement, the cost rises proportionally more as we get closer to what great looks like. That is, it's relatively inexpensive to move 50 or even 80% of the way towards what great looks like. But that final 30, 40, 50% is a good deal more expensive. In fact, for this delta, we might choose to satisfy it in a Pareto optimal way. That is, to do 80% of the movement for around 20% of the overall cost. We might say it's economically advantageous for us to move a good deal of the way towards what great looks like, but not all the way. That would be too expensive, and it may be unachievable, in fact. Let's take a look at another delta. Now, this is really important. Not all deltas are the same. The cost of moving from where we are today to what great looks like actually follows different profiles depending on what tool or process or individual is involved. In this case, the cumulative cost of delta movement escalates far more quickly for the first small part of the movement. Here we might say, well, we have to achieve some movement, and we're willing to spend actually quite a lot of money on moving us at least some way down this curve. Let's take a look at a third example. In here we have a directly linear, directly proportional move from where we are today to what great looks like. Although in this case, we may choose to only move a small part up that curve because for some reason this is a delta that we are less interested in, or because even that movement is extremely expensive and difficult to achieve. And lastly, we have a stepped profile here. We have some kind of ratchet cost associated with the cost of movement. And in this case, we've decided we're going to take a couple of those hits and get some good movement, but we're not going to take what looks like the third hit in this case. So across A, B, C, and D here, we've narrowed the deltas by different amounts. Overall, that narrowing across those tools, processes, education, people, materials will add up to move the organization, this whole entity gap or this whole entity delta, from the larger one in the upper part of this diagram to be more narrow. And so that's great. That looks like our digital transformation or our transformational change program has succeeded. It's all over. Well, if only that were the case. Because remember what we said a little bit earlier about the rate of change only increasing. Remember what we said about those wants and needs changing more per day than they ever have before. Well, that brings its own challenge. You see, as we narrow the delta, what great looks like moves away from us. Actually, this is the difficulty with transformational change from here on in. This is the easiest it will ever be. This is the slowest that change will ever be. From here on in, change is constant and faster every day. If we're not constantly managing these deltas, we're not constantly moving forward closer to what great looks like will move away. The delta will grow, and the innovator or disruptor will be better enabled to come in, satisfy those changing wants and needs, and eat our lunch. But how do we narrow those deltas? How do we engage every individual, every team, division, stakeholder group, supplier and customer? How do we begin this threat reduction work? Well, by now the answer should be becoming clear. We enable the whole entity and everything within it to be the best it can be. And yes, that might be a constrained best it can be, but they must be empowered. They must own what they do, what they are, in order to be the best they can be. Products, services, technology, process, education, tools and techniques, materials, regulations and rules, everything. Not just within this organization, but also within the network it sits in. That might mean even helping the regulator to be the best they can be. So what about AgileSHIFT? Well, AgileSHIFT is the change in behavior and thinking across the organization that enables the whole entity to start to work on, to continue to work on being the best it can be. AgileSHIFT shows your people how to enable themselves and others to be the best they can be. Perhaps the word enable is the very best definition of what Agile means today. It means enabled. That lowercase Agile, Agile with a lowercase a. We enable our people to be the best they can be. That means the teams could be using Scrum. They could be using Scaled Agile Framework or SAFe, Prince2, PMI, ITIL, anything that helps them to be the best they can be. They could use different tools, they could use different products, different services. You see, narrowing deltas is constrained by time and cost and regulation and expectation, which means that we have a scarcity of factors. We have a scarcity of time, of cost. We have constraint on regulation. We are constrained by expectations. This scarcity means that we will need to program manage this work. This can't be a random sequence of micro changes across the organization that is uncoordinated, and we hope the organization will track its way to being the best it can be. We need to understand the cost and the value delivered, the benefit accrued, and therefore the value delivered of this change, of this transformation. And this program of work is going to, by its very nature, be multimodal. It's going to be a collection of different ways of working, different ideas, different cultures and behaviors. The main question is, are they positive? Are they moving us forward? This is actually what enterprise transformation program should mean. It shouldn't mean we're all going to work in exactly the same way from now on, and we're going to hope that this way is close enough to a tech agile way of working for us to deliver some benefit in the next 3 years. This transformational change program should be delivering benefit on day 1 and day 100 and day 1000 and day 10,000. This is a program that will run and deliver its value and benefit over a long period of time. So we shouldn't be constrained by single ways of working. We should be helping people to work in the way that's best for the work that they're doing. We should help them to use the tools that are best for the way that for the work that they're doing. But we should do that within the constraint of needing some organization, some control. And we should recognize that this work is ongoing. Now this brings us to the end of the presentation. This feature has described only a small part of the power of AgileSHIFT. AgileSHIFT is there to help, to support organizations that are facing these challenging scenarios, these challenging contexts. If your organization is going through that kind of change and transformation challenge, then you need to go to the AXELOS website, AXELOS.com, and click on AgileSHIFT and read more about AgileSHIFT and understand how it can help and support you. If you want to connect with me, please do so. Twitter and LinkedIn are both available there for you. And please do, as a final note, remember that change and transformation get bigger and faster from here on in. This is the easiest it will ever be. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you.